The chapel of Wexcombe Hall held more silk and more jewels than it had seen in a generation, and at the head of the aisle, where every gown was a shade of cream or rose or pale spring green, the bride stood in unbroken black. Not the gray of half-mourning, not the violet a widow might wear when a year had passed and the worst of grief had thinned. Black. Bombazine and crepe, the dress a woman wears to bury someone she has loved, and Eleanor Vane wore it to be married. The guests did not gasp, because gasping was vulgar. But the small sounds a crowded room makes when it forgets itself, the rustle of 200 fans lowered at once, the catch of breath behind gloved hands, all of it stopped. In the silence she walked, and the silence was the loudest thing in the chapel. At the altar, the Duke of Marinford did not turn to look at her the way a bridegroom is supposed to, with the soft pride that announces a man pleased with his bargain. He had turned at the first whisper, at the first wrong note in the music of a wedding, and once he saw her, he did not look away, and he did not look pleased, and he did not look anything a man is permitted to look on his wedding morning. He looked the way a man looks at a wound. He has been told, is healed, and finds is not. To the season, she was the impoverished gentlewoman. The Duke had been pressed into marrying to settle a debt that was not even hers, and the room had decided, before she reached the altar, that the black gown was a tantrum, a poor woman's protest, the bad manners of a creature who did not understand the honor being done her. They were wrong about the gown. They were wrong about almost everything, and what none of them knew, yet what the Duke himself did not yet fully understand, was that the dress had nothing to do with him at all. If you have ever been looked at and called the wrong name in your own heart, stay with this one. Watch what she does with the silence. She had not chosen the black to shame him. She had chosen it because 3 weeks before her wedding, her brother had died, and there had been no one to permit her to grieve him. And a marriage to a duke does not pause for a debtor's drowned brother. So she wore the only honest thing she had left. The room read defiance. The Duke, alone among them, read something nearer to the truth, and the reading cost him a steadiness he had spent 10 years building. To understand the black gown, a person had to go back 6 months. To the autumn, the creditors came to the house on Covell Street and found a young woman of 24, doing the work of a household that had once kept 11 servants, and now kept none. Eleanor had buried her father the previous spring, and her father had left behind a name with old honor in it, and new debt under it. The debt run up by her brother Thomas in rooms she had never entered, against markers she had never seen. When the solicitor read the accounts aloud in the cold front parlor, she had understood 3 things in the space of a minute. The house was gone. The little money was gone. And the largest of the markers, £4,000, was held by a man she had never met, a man whose name the solicitor spoke with the particular flatness people use for the very great. He held the title of Marinford. She had expected a summons and a humiliation. What came instead was stranger. A letter, in a hard, plain hand, proposing not collection but marriage. The debt to be cancelled by the union, her brother's remaining obligations to be quietly absorbed, the house on Covell Street to be retained, for her brother's use during his lifetime. She read it 4 times. There was no warmth in it and no cruelty in it. It was a transaction described by a man who did not trouble to dress transactions in feeling. She did not know that the Duke had paid attention months before to a small thing she had done in a draper's shop, and that the letter was not the cold thing it pretended to be. She knew only that she had no other door, and so she walked through this one. The first time she stood in the same room as the man who held her future was in the long gallery at Marinford House, where the family portraits hung in their heavy frames and the autumn light came gray through tall windows. He was taller than she had pictured and stiller. He stood at the far end with his hands behind his back, and he did not cross to her, and he did not bow over her hand with the practiced grace other men used. He looked at her for a moment too long, and then he said, his voice low and level, that he hoped the terms had been clear. She said they had. He asked whether she had questions. She had 100, and asked none of them. There was a stillness in him that other people in her life would have filled with chatter, and he did not fill it. And she found, to her own surprise, that she did not need to either. What she noticed and dismissed was the way his eyes had moved once to her hands. Her gloves were good gloves, mended at one fingertip with stitches so small only a person looking for them would find them, and his eyes had found them. And something in his face had shifted and shut again so quickly she told herself she had imagined it. She told herself a great many things in those weeks. She had learned to. A woman with no money and no protector learns to talk herself out of hope the way other women talk themselves out of fear, because hope is the more expensive of the two. The Duke of Marinford was 36 years old, and 10 years before he had been a different man, and the difference had a name he did not say. His household knew not to mention the late Duchess. The portrait of her had been taken down from the gallery and turned to the wall in a room no one entered. The servants who had been with him longest knew that he had married once for love, against the wishes of everyone whose wishes were supposed to govern such things, and that within 2 years she was dead, and that he had decided, in the cold arithmetic of his grief, that the fault was his. He had been told she was strong. He had believed it, because believing it was convenient. He had not seen what was in front of him, and a woman had died of what he did not see. And he had built, over the 10 years since, a discipline whose entire purpose was never to fail to see again. People called him cold. He let them. Cold was easier to carry than the truth. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, carried a different cargo entirely. She had survived a marriage of duty, and outlived a husband she had not loved, and raised a son who had broken her one rule by loving where he should have calculated, and she had watched that love kill itself, and she had drawn from the wreck a single iron conviction. That feeling was the enemy of survival, and that her son's second marriage would be governed by sense if she had to govern it herself. When she learned he meant to marry the vain girl, a debtor's daughter with a drowning brother and a mended glove, she did not rage. She smiled the smile she kept for occasions that required management. The first time she received Eleanor, in the gold drawing-room with the rival already installed at her side, she did not rise, and she did not offer her hand, and she let the silence do the first of her work for her. She looked her up and down with the practiced economy of a woman pricing goods, and her gaze rested a moment on the mended fingertip of Eleanor's glove, and her mouth made the smallest movement, and she said to the room and not to Eleanor that it was a charity, really, and one hoped the girl had the grace to be grateful. The tea was poured by a footman in livery worth more than Eleanor's whole wardrobe, and the cup that came to her was the plainest in the set. And these were small things, and small things were the dowager's chosen instrument. She did not strike. She arranged. She placed Eleanor in the lowest chair and seated Lady Sophia where the light fell kindly on her, and she asked Eleanor no question that could be answered with dignity, and she conducted the half-hour as a demonstration, for the rival's benefit, and her own, that the debtor's daughter was a thing being tolerated rather than a person being received. The rival had a name and a fortune and a gown, the color of crushed raspberries, and she was the daughter of an earl, and the dowager had chosen her the way a general chooses ground. Lady Sophia Caro had been raised to be a duchess, and had been told so since she could walk, and she sat at the dowager's right hand, with the serene confidence of a woman who has never once been wrong about her own importance. She looked at Eleanor with a small, kind, terrible pity. To Sophia, the debtor's daughter was a delay, an embarrassment her future mother had been forced to entertain, and she said as much, sweetly, over tea, that some women simply did not understand when a thing was beyond their reach. Eleanor heard the word charity and the word grateful, and she held her cup steady and her face still, and only the pulse at her throat moved, a quick small beat she could not command, and across the room the Duke saw it. He had been standing at the window with his back half to them, and he turned at the word charity. And he watched the pulse jump in her throat. And he watched her set the cup down without a sound. And his jaw set like carved stone. He said nothing then, not to her, and not to the room. That night he gave an instruction to his steward that no further accounts of the late Mr. Rowe Vane were to be pursued, and that any tradesman still owed by the Cavell Street house was to be paid in full, and quietly. And he did not tell Eleanor he had done it, because he had not done it for the telling. She learned what the household truly was by accident. In her second week as a betrothed guest under its roof, when she rose early and walked the cold corridors, because she could not sleep and heard a child crying. The Duke had a ward, a girl of 7, named Beatrice, the orphaned daughter of a cousin, killed in the war, and Beatrice did not speak. She had not spoken in a year, the nurse said, not since the news, and the great house with its silent master had not coaxed a word from her. Eleanor found the child sitting on the cold floor of the nursery with a broken wooden horse in her lap, the kind of toy a soldier father might have carved. The leg snapped clean at the joint, and the child was weeping without sound, her shoulders moving and no cry coming out of her, as though even her grief had learned it was not wanted. Eleanor did not call the nurse, and did not summon authority. She sat down on the cold floor in her dressing gown, the boards hard through the thin cloth, and she did not reach for the child, who would have flinched from reaching. She reached for the horse. She held out her hand for it, palm open, and waited, and after a long moment, the small hands gave it over. "Let us see what can be mended," she said. "Not what is wrong, not poor thing, not you must not cry, only that." And she turned the broken toy in the firelight, and found that the leg had not splintered, but parted at an old glued seam, and she found a length of thread in the pocket of her dressing gown. And she bound the leg of the wooden horse with small, even stitches, while the child watched her hands and not her face. She did not ask the child to speak. She did not pity her aloud. She talked instead about the horse, about what a sound little horse it was, and how it had only wanted mending and not throwing away. And when the leg held, she set the horse on the floor and walked it across the boards on its 4 legs, making the small clopping sound under her breath that one makes for a child without thinking. And the child reached out and took it and held it against her chest. That was all. Eleanor stayed until the weeping stopped, and then she rose and said good night and left the child with the horse. She did it because the child was crying, and a crying child should not be. Alone. She did not know the Duke had come to the nursery door at the first sound and had stopped there unseen in the dark of the corridor, and had watched the whole of it, the open palm and the patient stitches and the small clopping horse, and had not been able to make himself cross the threshold and break it. He told himself it meant nothing. A kindness to a child meant only that she was kind, and kindness was common, and he had built his life on not mistaking common things for rare ones. He told himself this in the way a man tells himself the floor is solid when he has already felt it shift. The wedding was set for the 2nd week of December, and as it approached, the dowager's management grew more elaborate and more public. At a dinner for 30, the long table laid with the Marinford silver, and the room full of the people whose opinion constituted the world, she seated Eleanor below the salt, and Lady Sophia at the Duke's right hand, and she conducted the conversation so that the debtor's daughter was addressed by no one of consequence, and Lady Sophia was addressed by everyone. The talk moved up and down the table around Eleanor as water moves around a stone, never once touching her, and she sat in her plain gray gown among the diamonds, and ate what was set before her, and answered the 1 or 2 remarks aimed at her with a quiet that gave the table nothing to feed on. Lady Sophia, at the Duke's hand, was luminous and easy, laughing at the right moments, deferring to the dowager with the grace of long practice, and more than once her glance found Eleanor down the length of the table and rested there with that small, kind, terrible pity, as one looks at a guest who has wandered into the wrong house and does not yet know it. Eleanor ate little and said less, and bore it with a composure that the dowager found almost provoking. Late in the meal, a guest, emboldened by wine and by the dowager's evident approval, asked the table loudly whether it was true. The bride came with nothing but her debts, and laughed at his own wit, and Lady Sophia laughed her small kind laugh behind her fan, and the dowager did not stop it. And for a moment, the whole bright table tilted toward Eleanor to watch her color. Eleanor set down her fork. She looked for a moment at the candles, at the way the light moved in the silver, and she did not weep, and did not flush, and the Duke, at the head of the table, set down his glass with a sound that was not loud, and silenced the laughter completely. He did not make a speech. He said only, his voice level, that Miss Vane was his guest and his betrothed, and that he would hear her spoken of with the respect owed to both, and he said it to the wine-flushed guest, and not to his mother. And the distinction was understood by everyone present. The dowager's fan moved once a small adjustment, and she smiled and turned the conversation, and the dinner went on. Yet something had been seen. The room had watched the Duke defend the woman they had decided not to see. And the room began, very slightly, to wonder whether it had read the matter correctly. In the days after the dinner, the proximity between them changed. Not into warmth. The Duke did not have warmth to give in any currency Eleanor recognized, but into a kind of careful weather. He found reasons to be where she was. He came upon her in the library one gray afternoon, when she had taken refuge among the books, because the books did not look at her with pity, and he found her with a volume open on her knees and the firelight on her face, and he stopped in the doorway as he had stopped in the nursery. She rose. He told her to sit. The command was abrupt and plain, and she sat before she had decided to, and he crossed to the fire and stood looking into it, and he said that his late father had built the library, and that few people used it now. She said she was sorry to intrude. He said, without turning, that she did not intrude, and the two words sat in the warm room longer than two words should. Her body knew things her mind would not sign for. When he stood near her at the fire, she was aware of exactly where he was without looking, the way one is aware of an open window in winter, and her pulse moved, and she pressed her gloved hands flat against the book to still them. The fire shifted in the grate, and threw its light up the spines of his father's books, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the not speaking was not the awkward kind, but the rare kind, the kind that asks nothing. He asked her after a time what she was reading, and she told him, and he said his father had marked that very volume in the margins, and that she might find his hand in it if she looked. And she turned to the flyleaf, and found the old ink, and something in the small intimacy of reading a dead man's notes in his son's presence undid a knot she had been carrying without knowing its name. He saw it. He saw the pulse and the pressed hands and the way her shoulders came down from their guard, and he saw her refuse to look at him, and he understood with the trained attention he had spent a decade building that she was not indifferent, and the understanding did something to him that he did not name and did not welcome. He had decided long ago not to want things he might fail. He found standing at his own fire beside a woman, in a mended glove, that the decision was no longer entirely his to make. It was that same week that the wound came up out of him, not in a speech, never in a speech, but in a single passage of an afternoon she would carry for the rest of her life. They had walked out on the estate grounds in the cold, the proper distance between them and a footman, at a discreet remove behind, and they had come to a small stone bridge over a frozen stream, and he had stopped on the bridge and looked down at the ice, and she had seen his hand move to his breast, to the pocket over his heart, the way it had moved more than once when he thought himself unobserved. He had spoken then, low, looking at the ice and not at her. He had been married before. She knew that. Everyone knew that. He said the thing everyone did not know. He said his wife had been ill for the better part of a year before she died, and that everyone, the physicians, the family, his wife herself, had told him she was mending, and that he had believed them because he was busy and because believing them was easier, and that by the time he saw the truth in her face, he said, "I told myself I had not failed her because no one had warned me." He said, "The truth is that I did not look." And then he had taken from the breast pocket a small thing, a folded square of paper, soft with handling. The last letter she had written him, which he carried still, and he had not unfolded it. He had only held it for a moment, and put it back, and he had said, "I decided I would never again fail to see what was in front of me." And he had looked at Eleanor then, finally, on the cold bridge, and the looking was the most naked thing she had ever seen on a human face, and neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than what had passed between them, and the frozen stream made its small sounds beneath them. She did not know what to do with what she had been given. She had come to this marriage prepared for coldness, prepared to be a duchess in name, and a stranger in fact, prepared to spend her one life beside a man who would never see her, and instead, she had been shown the exact wound that made him see, and she did not know how to defend herself against being seen. That night she lay awake in the grand, cold guest room and pressed her hand to her own breastbone where no letter lived, only the memory of a brother she had not yet been permitted to mourn, and she understood that she was in danger of something far worse than a loveless marriage. She was in danger of loving him, and a woman who had taught herself never to hope knew exactly how much that danger could cost. I know how this feels, to be shown a person's truest hurt and to want to be the one who heals it. Sit with her a moment longer, because the world was not finished with Eleanor. Then the door she had not seen coming opened, and it was her brother's death that opened it. The news reached Marinford House on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the wedding. Thomas Vane, who had run up the debts and run from the consequences, who had been her only living blood, and the boy she had carried on her hip when their mother died, had drowned, crossing a flooded ford in the dark, drunk, in flight from creditors. The Duke's own quiet payments had not reached in time. He was 21. The letter that brought the news was plain and brief, and the world that received it was not kind. A wedding 3 weeks off does not pause for a debtor's drowned brother. The dowager said as much. In the third voicing of the verdict that had followed Eleanor since the gold drawing room, this time to a circle of callers in the morning room with the door open, so Eleanor would hear it from the corridor, that of course the wedding would proceed, that the brother had been no loss to anyone, including the sister, if one were honest, and that one could only hope the girl had the sense to grieve privately and not embarrass the family with a display. Eleanor stood in the corridor, with her hand on the cold wall, and heard her brother called, "No loss," and the pulse jumped in her throat, and there was no one to see it and no Duke to set down his glass, because the Duke had been called away to London on the business of the marriage settlement, and did not yet know that Thomas Vane was dead. She grieved alone as she had been told to. She wrote no notices, and wore no mourning, and sat at dinners, and was fitted for her wedding clothes, the pale silks the dowager had ordered, and she said nothing. And the only place her grief was permitted to exist was in the dark of her own room, where it did her no good and no honor. She thought of the child Beatrice, who had been forbidden her grief by a different silence, and she understood the child now in her own body. And somewhere in those 3 terrible weeks, fitting the pale wedding silk against her own numbness, Eleanor Vane made a decision that was not defiance, and was not protest, though the world would read it as both. She decided she would not lie. She had lost the house and the money, and now the last of her blood, and she had nearly lost the habit of honesty in the bargain, and she found she would not give it up too. She would marry the Duke because she had said she would, and because she had come, against all her training, to want to. Even so, she would not stand at the altar and pretend that the worst thing had not happened. She would wear the truth, since the truth was the only dowry she had left. She had the black gown made quietly by a seamstress in the town, paid for with money she did not have, bombazine and crepe, the honest cloth of grief, and she told no one. And on the morning of the 2nd week of December she put it on. The dowager met her at the foot of the great stair and went white and then red, and said in a voice stripped at last of its polish that she would not be permitted, that it was an outrage, that she would change at once. Eleanor said she would not. The dowager said the Duke would be humiliated before the whole of society. Eleanor said quietly that she was sorry for it, and that she had buried her brother 3 weeks before with no one to stand beside her, and that she would not now bury him a second time under white silk, to spare the feelings of a room. And she walked past the dowager to the carriage, and the dowager, for the first time in the memory of her household, could not find the words to stop her. So she came down the aisle of the chapel at Wexcombe Hall in unbroken black, into the silence, and the room read defiance, and the room was wrong. The Duke at the altar turned and saw her, and saw what the room could not, that the gown was not aimed at him, that it was grief wearing the only honesty left to a woman the world had refused to let mourn. He saw the black, and he understood it in the space of a breath. And the discipline of 10 years, the whole architecture of never failing to see, met at last a thing worth seeing, and he did not flinch from it. The vicar, an elderly man unprepared for a bride in mourning, faltered over the opening words and looked to the Duke for guidance, and the dowager half rose from the front pew with her face composed for management, and her hands not composed at all, and the rival sat in raspberry silk, with her serene certainty cracking at the edges. And the whole bright, cruel room waited to see the impoverished bride humiliated. For her presumption, Eleanor stopped before the altar. She did not take the Duke's arm. She turned instead to the room, to the 200 faces arranged in their tiers of silk and jewels, and she spoke, and her voice did not shake. She said that she wore black because 3 weeks ago she had buried her brother, her only family, alone, with no one permitted to stand beside her, and that she would not be married pretending he had not lived. She said it plainly, without anger and without apology. A young woman in a debtor's mourning, telling the truth to a room that had decided she had no truths worth hearing. 12 words, and then a few more. The whole of it under a minute. And when she finished, the silence was a different silence than the one she had walked into. The first had been the silence of a room enjoying a scandal. This was the silence of a room that has just been made ashamed of itself. Into that silence the Duke stepped down from the altar. He crossed to her. The 3 strides the whole story had been building toward, and he stood before her in front of the dowager and the rival and the vicar and the 200, and he did not take her arm, and he did not whisper. He turned to the room, to the same room that had laughed at his mother's dinner table and called her brother no loss, the same arena where the verdict had been rendered. And into the silence she had made, he spoke. "I marry her in mourning, and gladly." The words landed once and were not taken back. The vicar's hands stilled. A sound went through the chapel, not a gasp now, but something lower. The sound a crowd makes when it revises itself all at once. And in the front pew, the Dowager Duchess sat slowly back down, and the management went out of her face, and for the first time her son had seen, she looked not formidable, but old. And her hand found the pew rail and held it, and she did not speak, because there was nothing in all her long arithmetic of survival that had prepared her for a man who would choose, in front of the world, the thing she had spent her life teaching him to fear. Beside her, Lady Sophia Carew rose, very pale, gathered her raspberry skirts with a dignity Eleanor had not credited her with, and inclined her head once to the bride, the gesture of a woman acknowledging that the ground she had stood on her whole life had simply, quietly, moved. She left before the vows. No one stopped her. The Duke offered Eleanor his arm then, and she took it, and the vicar, recovering, found his place in the book. And the wedding went forward, a bride in black, and a Duke who had chosen her in front of everyone, and when the old man asked who gave this woman to be married, there was a silence, because there was no one, her father dead and her brother drowned. And into that silence the Duke's ward, the child Beatrice, who had not spoken an ear, stood up in the second pew where the nurse had brought her, and said, in a small, clear voice that carried to the back of the chapel, the first word she had spoken since her father fell in the war. She said, "I will." It was not the answer the form required, and it was the only answer that mattered. And Eleanor turned and looked at the child and could not speak, and the Duke's composed face broke at last, not into weeping. He was not a man who would weep in a chapel, but into something that had been locked away for 10 years, and was now in front of everyone. Simply and helplessly let out. The settlement was confirmed within the week, the solicitor's seal on the documents that made the marriage and its provisions irrevocable, so that no later management by the dowager could undo what had been done in the chapel. The house on Cavell Street, which Thomas would never use now, Eleanor asked to be given instead to the seamstress in the town who had made her mourning gown on credit and trust, and it was done. The remaining debts dissolved. The dowager removed to the dower house at the edge of the estate, where she lived out her correction not in cruelty, but in the smaller rooms of a woman who had been confidently wrong, and in the spring when Beatrice brought her a posy from the garden, she took it, and that was the beginning of her humbling, becoming something gentler. By Christmas, the great house was not the silent place it had been. Snow fell past the tall library windows, the same windows where he had once told her she did not intrude, and a fire burned in the grate that had been cold the first afternoon she sheltered there. Beatrice sat on the hearthrug with the wooden horse. Eleanor had mended in the first week, walking it slowly across the warm boards, and she talked now. Not constantly, but enough. The dam once broken, letting the water through at its own pace. The Duke sat with a book he was not reading, and watched his wife at the window. And Eleanor stood in the snowlight with her hand resting on the cold glass, no longer in black, in a soft green gown the color of spring. And she was at last in a house that was hers, mourned where mourning was owed, and seen where she had been invisible. On the mantel above the fire stood a small wooden horse with a mended leg, and beside it, unfolded now and framed behind glass where the firelight could reach it, the last letter of a woman the Duke had once failed to see, set out at last in the open, instead of carried hidden over his heart. Because a man who has learned to see no longer needs to keep his grief in his pocket. Eleanor had asked him to frame it. She had said that the dead should be allowed in the room. He had done it the same afternoon. The snow came down past the glass, and the child spoke softly to the horse, and the fire held the cold at bay, and the house that had turned a portrait to the wall now let its dead sit in the warm light alongside the living. She had worn black to her own wedding and told the truth to a room that did not want it, and the truth had not ruined her. It had married her. The season would tell the story for years, and it would never quite agree on what it had witnessed, whether scandal or courage, or something the language of the season had no word for. That was the whole of what the season never understood about Eleanor, that the honest cloth she chose for grief had been all along the only thing in the chapel worth seeing. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's quiet courage moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you, and I will see you in the next story.